12 quilting don'ts that every quilter should know. Hi everyone, it's Mary from Joyful and Mary Quilting, and you know what? We quilters are really good at learning what to do, but sometimes the don'ts are the things that make the biggest difference in our quilting experience. So let's go over some quilting don'ts. It can make your quilting journey smoother, easier, and you know what, really a lot more joyful. So keep in mind, you may not agree with each of my don'ts. So I'd love you to comment below and let me know why my don't is a do when you quilt. I'd love to hear your perspective. Number 1, don't skip pressing. You know what? I feel it's really important to press every single seam before moving on. I am not happy with no pressing or not even finger pressing. I just feel it isn't enough to stabilize the fabrics and seams when it comes to precision. So let's take a look at some samples and I'll talk to you about what is pressed, what isn't pressed, and why it does make a difference. Each of these pieces gets progressively flatter as I add different techniques to the pressing. So the key to maintaining accuracy when we're measuring or adding additional pieces to our blocks and putting them into a quilt top is that we have a well-pressed seam. So let's talk about what I have here. First of all, I'm using 2.5-inch squares because that seems to work best. And I have 2 contrasting fabrics, 2.5-inch squares that I've basically put into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different categories. So this is what we're using. We always put them right sides together and we sew a seam. The first method I'm going to show you is just no pressing at all. No pressing means we just sew our seams together and then we open up our piece and we take our next piece and add to it. Now, here's where the issue comes in. You can pin, you can do whatever you want to make sure everything lays flat, but as you can see right here, it is super easy to get a tuck right in this seam just because it's not pressed. It's not pressed flat. So no pressing to me is not even an option. I press all my seams, as I said. Now let's talk about finger pressing. And we do finger pressing a lot. And especially if you don't have an iron close by, you can finger press periodically through your block construction, but you want to make sure that you do actually use your iron and press as well. And here's why. We're going to press this towards the dark. Finger pressing is basically just like folding paper. We crease it, and fabric actually creases kind of like paper, but not as crisply. So if I do this and I finger press, even using my fingernails, you can see that it kind of bumps up a little bit right here. It's not pressed super flat. It can't be because we haven't used anything that's going to hold it down, such as an iron pressing solution, something to that effect. So we've got this piece. You can do it, but you have to be really careful, once again, when you add this piece to it, that you flatten everything out, pin, and then sew. It's, again, very easy to get a tuck right here because we don't have everything pressed out flat. So that's pressing, finger pressing. Now, sometimes we will use a little pressing tool, a flat end on this wood, and you can do the same thing. You can do just like you would your finger, and you can press along here. And again, if you don't have an iron close by, you can see this is actually a little bit flatter than just finger pressing, and it does help when I'm adding that second piece. It's a little easier for me to pin it flat. But once again, I'm just not happy with that. I really feel like I need to use an iron. Now, the piece that I have here, I actually used pressing solution and my iron. So I took my pressing solution, and there's a video on this, so you can take a look at that if you want, but I marked on the seam with my pressing solution and my pressing marker, and then I pressed toward the dark. Now, as you can see, if we compare it, we still have a little bit of a bump in there, but it's pretty good. It's pretty flat. Now the final piece that I did here, I used pressing solution and then I used a clapper, just a tailor's clapper. Once I've pressed it, I take off my iron, I put my clapper down, and this one definitely is the flattest of all. So if we go back and take a look at that very first one with no pressing, and then our last one that was pressed with the pressing solution and the clapper, there's just no doubt about it. For accuracy, we have a nice piece that's flat. We can measure it. It's our perfect 4.5 inch, which is what we get when we add 2 2.5 inch squares together. And this, look at, It's just a little hard to do. It doesn't lay flat. We have to pull and tug. I find that pressing is easier. So don't forget to press. Number 2, don't ignore the grain line. Now the grain line is the stretchiness basically of your fabric. The way that we cut our fabrics, we want to make sure that we have the least stretchiness on the outsides of our blocks. We can accommodate for stretchiness within the block just by sewing things together, but the outsides, don't forget about that grain. So if you look at our fabric, if we have cut a strip selvage to selvage, the way that it is the least stretchy is the length of our yard or 2 yards or whatever the yardage is. This direction here, crosswise from the width of fabric, is actually the least stretch. As you can see, if you just pull on it, you can tell. Just pull on that and you can see that's not going to stretch. Now, the cross grain, which is from selvage to selvage, has a little bit more stretchiness, as you can see. I'm pulling it here, it does not stretch for the lengthwise. The crosswise, it's a little stretchier, not bad, but it actually does move a bit. And then we have our bias stretchiness, and that's when we cut our fabric so that it is actually cut across at an angle. I cut this square out, as you can see by the pattern, up and down. This is just a regularly cut square where we have that lengthwise grain right here that does not stretch. Then we have the crosswise grain that stretches a teeny bit. But then I cut this piece on the bias. So you can see from the pattern, this is how I cut it. And when we stretch this, lots of stretch in both directions. And when we cut a piece of fabric, let's cut this one right here, from corner to corner, if we are cutting triangles, this is our bias edge. So you can see lots of stretch. If you're putting this in a block, you don't want this to be on the outside of your block because your block is going to be difficult to put into another block. Really important. Don't forget to check the grain before you cut your pieces and make sure that the outside edge of your piece is either the lengthwise or the crosswise grain and it's not the bias. Number 3. Don't sew with a dull rotary blade or a dull needle. It's so important that when we make our cuts or when we sew our pieces together, that those pieces and those cuts are not going to have jagged edges or snags or pieces that aren't cut all the way through. So here's a key that you can look towards. If you have a dull rotary blade, when you're cutting, you're going to hear a weird sound. It's going to sound like a crunch or it's going to skip when you finish. Now here's a good example. When I cut this one, the first part cut fine, but when I cut another piece off of the strip, it didn't cut the end, and it's because I've got a nick in my blade. So sometimes when you have a nick, you have to go all the way, the blade has to go all the way around. You may be okay with the first cut, and then the second cut does something like this. So it's really important that you check that blade. If it's doing this, it is not worth the frustration. If you're cutting with a dull blade, you're going to have to push harder, which means that you could cause an accident. It's easy to get off course, especially when you're holding a ruler and you're trying to dig into that fabric with your blade. It's just not worth it. Change the blade. Now the same holds true with a needle, with your sewing machine needle. People don't realize how often we really do need to change those. I mean, I've had people say, I've had the same needle in my machine for 12 years. No, no, no. And if you take a look, you can see as you're sewing, there might be a snag where the needle goes down and up on your fabric. Now, it's sometimes suggested that we change our needle with every project, with so many hours of quilting, and you can do that if you want. I don't. Most quilters don't, I think. If there's some that do, great. But sometimes we just kind of wait for those signs. If you hear a clunking noise in your machine when that needle goes down, dull needle. That is an issue. You want to make sure that you change that needle. Don't cut with a dull blade. It's dangerous. It ruins fabric. Don't sew with a dull needle. It also ruins fabric, ruins your seams, and it makes your quilting experience that much more difficult. Number 4, don't assume your 1/4 inch seam allowance is accurate. Now, I've tested all sorts of ways to get that accurate 1/4 inch seam. You can look, there's several videos that I have online where I do actual tests. But I'm just going to show you. Sometimes we just eyeball the seam, we just sew it, we think, it'll be fine, it'll be okay. And when we finish up and we press our piece open, then add other pieces, it's not okay. It's off. And we want to make sure that we have an accurate seam at the very beginning when we first start sewing our pieces together, because it just gets worse. If that accurate seam is not there at the beginning, it's really not going to be there when you finish your block. Now, some people will say, oh, my 1/4 inch foot is perfect. Test it first and make sure that it's perfect. Some have marked, I like to mark my seam allowance. I put a guide on my sewing machine. I have used painter's tape that I stack. That's also in my free workshop, how to create the perfect quilt block every time. You can look at that and I show you how to do that. I like to do that, and I test it every time before I start a new project to make sure that I have an accurate seam. Now, you want to make sure you check it each time for 2 reasons. Fabric makes a difference. If you are sewing a seam and that overlap, when you press toward the dark side, you have a little bit of a bump there. That changes your seam. So if you check it first on your sewing machine and you sew it and press it open, if you need to adjust the tape or your guide, you can do that and it works well. Your thread might be thicker. That also takes up space. Once again, sew your seam and then double check it to make sure. It saves a lot of frustration later. I just want to give you a little example here. Now, I used my 1/4 inch foot for my sewing machine. I have not tested it ahead of time. I just went ahead and used it. Here's my 1/4 inch foot. It's got the little guide under there. I put it on my sewing machine and then I sewed these 2 pieces together using that guide rather than tape on my machine like I usually do. So, think it should be okay. It says 1/4 inch on the foot. I'll take my ruler and I'm going to measure that finished piece. I've pressed it open as flat as I could get it because I used my pressing marker, I used my clapper, I used my iron, my hot iron, and look, when I place my 2 1/4 inch center marking, you can see my piece doesn't come all the way to the edge here. My piece doesn't come all the way to the edge here. That means that I took too big of a bite out of that seam. That was my 1/4 inch foot. That's what it did. That's why I prefer to check every time. Now, some people will say, oh, as long as you're consistent, everything is okay. It's not okay, and here's why. These are the 2 pieces I've sewn together. Now, let's say they should measure 4.5 inches, right? And let's say I want to add a piece to the top of this that is not pieced. It's just a 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangle. When I put those right sides together, they don't match. They are off. You can see that if I match one edge, look at how much I'm short on this edge. Now, I can kind of scooch it in the middle and, just fudge it a little bit, but you don't know if as you go along, I'm probably a 1/16 of an inch off on this little piece. If my quilt continues on, that 1/16 of an inch keeps multiplying. And by the time I get a large strip on my quilt, I am way off. Now, I, of course, would ease everything in, but you don't want to mess with that. Just make sure that you have an accurate 1/4 inch seam to begin with, and you don't have to worry about it. You've then got that accuracy from the beginning all the way to the end of your block. Number 5, don't mix pre-washed and unwashed fabrics. Now, some people never pre-wash, some always pre-wash, and that's fine. Just make sure that all of your fabrics are either pre-washed or not pre-washed, but don't mix them up in the same block. And here's why. The unwashed piece is going to shrink the first time you wash the quilt. The pre-washed piece is already shrunk. So when you put these together, they match just fine before the quilt is washed. And once you've washed it, this piece does not shrink and this one does, and it messes up the look of your quilt. So let's take a look at this one. I cut these 2 5-inch squares from the exact same fabric. It's a good quality fabric, and I measured and they both were 5 inches, 5 inches square. This was pre-washed and dried, and take a look at this. It is almost a 1/4 inch off on all edges. Actually, it's about 1/8 of an inch off. You can see 1/8 of an inch, a little more on this side. And that's because this piece was pre-washed. Now think about that. If you've got a block and all of a sudden it's shrinking in 1/8 of an inch on every one of the pieces in the block, and this one is not shrinking. This is the one that was not pre-washed, so it will shrink. This is the one that was pre-washed and it won't shrink. It can cause a mess in your quilt block. You just want to make sure that you pay attention to whether or not your fabrics are pre-washed or not. Sometimes if I pre-wash fabrics, I'll just take a safety pin and I'll clip it in the corner so that I know, because I've ironed it and it looks pretty good. If you put a safety pin there, I know, oh, all the safety pin fabrics are pre-washed, and then I've got those set aside. I don't mix them. I always use the same type of fabric in a particular quilt, either all pre-washed or none pre-washed. Number 6, don't skip measuring your quilt top when you are adding borders. This is so important. It's really hard for me to show it here because it's a big job when you're adding a border. But we've all seen quilt tops where the borders are wavy. And I mean wavy. They are attached to the side of the quilt, each side of the quilt, and the border goes like this. It is really tough to quilt that border when you've got all those waves in there. It tends to make tucks when you're trying to flatten everything out. You don't want that to happen. So that usually happens when you skip the measuring step when it comes to your borders. So how do you skip it? What happens is when you are adding borders to a quilt top, you measure the quilt top in 3 places vertically, 3 places horizontally. So let's just take vertical. You'll measure one vertical side, the other vertical side, and down the middle. If they're all the same, if it measures the same all the way across, you're good. That's the length that you cut your border strips to. If they're not all the same, maybe they're just a teeny bit off, you just add those 3 numbers together, divide by 3, and cut your border strips that length. Then when you are pinning your borders to your quilt, you pin in the middle first. Make sure you have the middle of your border strip, the middle of your quilt top, pin it. Pin the top end, pin the bottom end, or the horizontal sides, depending on what you're working on. And then you'll pin halfway between each pin until it's secure. That is what's really important. Now, the lazy way to do it, which I have done many, many times previously before I found out why my borders were so wavy, was you just cut a strip of fabric however long you want, sew 2 together if you know it needs more than 40 inches, and then start at the top, right sides together, and sew all the way down the edge, and then hack it off at the end, and you press your borders toward the border strip. Sounds easy, but you know what? That's where those wavy borders come from. And people will say, oh, I do this all the time and I never have it. And you know, that's probably true. There are a lot of you that probably have done that. You smooth everything out nicely and it can work. But if you're just sewing it on, sewing those strips on, and letting your walking foot work along the edge of your quilt, it just causes that wavy stuff. So if you never have the problem, you never measure, and it all works out, bravo, you're doing a great job. You're doing it the right way for you. But if you are having that issue with wavy borders, go back to square one, measure the 3 places, cut your border strips to that average measurement, pin, 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 guaranteed those border strips will not be wavy. Number 7, don't rush the cutting step. This is so important because it can easily get off course when you're cutting. If you cut too quickly, if you are stacking too many layers of fabric, take your time. You think, oh, I'm going to save time because I'm going to stack 8 layers of fabric together. And that does work. But for me, I have found that it's really difficult when I stack so many layers together to get a good cut. If I have a brand new blade, yeah, usually I can get a pretty good cut. But it doesn't last long. Those blades do not last forever. So I prefer to cut no more than 4 layers at one time. I can actually cut pretty quickly with 4 layers, and I find that when I'm cutting more than 8, some blades will even say you can cut 10 layers. It takes me longer, I have to push harder, that's harder on your hand, it's harder on your shoulder, and you know what, it can easily get off track. So I'll show you how I would cut this one just to make sure. This is 8 layers. Tiny mistakes here can multiply across all of your quilts. So you want to make sure that everything is cut accurately and that your ruler or your fabric or your cutter doesn't slip. Now I've got 8 layers here and I have a brand new blade. And these 8 layers, this is not a real good quality fabric, it's kind of thin, but you can see that when I cut, let's say I want to cut 1.5 inches, this edge is cut, and I'm going to use my cutter. Can you see right here? It's smushing up because I've got so many layers in here. when I finished, this is a new blade, and look what's happened. It just doesn't cut well. And we want to make sure that when we use our cutter and when we are cutting, we don't have to keep redoing it. Because what happens is we start chewing up that edge. That takes away from accuracy. If we are cutting just 4 layers at one time, instead of 8 layers, here's 4, I'm going to do the same thing, same cutter. Let's say I want to cut 3/4 of an inch. And look at how easy that was. It's easier to cut fewer layers at one time rather than cut a whole bunch. This actually saves me time. Number 8, don't sew when you're tired. Have you ever decided to finish up one more block or one more patch for your quilt top, and then you made a mistake? You've sewn the wrong sides together, or your star points are facing the wrong direction on one side of your star. So you have to rip it out, and you rip it out, you try again, and you make the same mistake over. It's really difficult. Maybe you're cutting pieces and you realize you just cut the last set of strips a ½ an inch off. Ask me how I know. I've done it. I've done it too many times. Fatigue and cutting, sewing, or quilting just don't mix. If you're tired, walk away. Your fabric will still be there tomorrow. Number 9, don't iron. You want to press your seams. I've said this before, but I really think it's well worth repeating. If you are ironing, that usually means that we are taking our iron and we're circling it around, we're pushing here and there and back and forth. We do that sometimes because we think we're going to scorch our ironing pad or scorch our piece. We want to keep the iron moving. You don't need to do that. When you do it, what happens, especially if you're using a pressing solution, is that push that you give to the fabric when you are ironing can distort and set that piece wonky, and you don't want that to happen. So what we do is when it's time to press our seam, take your iron and press it. Pick it up, press it. You want to make sure that you don't move it, you just leave it there until the seam looks the way you want it to look. It's so important that you press up and down, firm and quick, and your blocks will stay perfectly square. Number 10, don't ignore pattern instructions. Usually when we make a quilt from a pattern in a book or a pattern that we've purchased, we read the pattern first, cut our fabric pieces, gather our materials and our tools that we need, and then step by step we follow the instructions in the pattern. It's important that you read your pattern carefully, because you know what? Sometimes there's a little hidden gem in the fine print that saves us hours of unpicking later when we've made the mistake and not followed those instructions. I cannot tell you how many people have contacted me either about a pattern of mine or sometimes somebody else's design, and they're totally frustrated because their block is just not coming out right. And it's because they missed a step in the pattern, or they just didn't read the pattern at all and they thought they could just put it together. Many pattern designers have specific instructions when it comes to assembling a quilt block or a quilt their own way. Read those. If you've got a better way, of course you can do that. But at the start, give the designer a chance, read the pattern through, and then read each set of instructions along the way. Those tips, often included by the designer, can make or break accuracy, and it also can help you with the assembly of your block. Don't not read your pattern. Number 11, don't be afraid to rip out a seam. I have a great video on how to use a seam ripper, how to take advantage of that little red ball, how you position it, where you put your fabric under the foot to anchor it in place and rip out that seam carefully and accurately. If something is off and it'll bug you forever, just fix it. If it doesn't bother you, then it's not a big deal. But a few minutes spent ripping out a seam is way better than wishing you had every single time you look at the quilt. So don't be afraid to use that seam ripper as needed. It just takes a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes maybe, depending on what you're ripping out. And the satisfaction you get from having that error corrected is well worth the time. Okay, number 12 is kind of long, but please bear with me. Don't compare your quilt to others. Oh my gosh, this is so important. Every quilt tells its maker's story, and that's something to celebrate, not to compare. We all come from different quilting places. Some of us have been sewing since childhood. Others just bought their first rotary cutter last month. Some love traditional blocks with Civil War reproductions, while others love bold, modern designs with saturated solids and asymmetrical layouts. That's what makes quilting so incredible. It's a reflection of you. Your fabric choices, your color palettes, and your design decisions say something about your personality and your season of life. Maybe you're drawn to calm blues and neutrals because you're craving peace. Or maybe your scraps are wild and joyful because you're experimenting. Or maybe your seams really aren't perfect yet, but they're getting better with every project. The truth is, there will always be someone who quilts more precisely, faster, or with more experience. But there will also be someone who looks at your quilt and feels inspired to start their own. Comparing only steals the joy from both ends. So instead of measuring yourself against others, celebrate your progress. Enjoy the process of learning. And when you look around the quilting community, whether in a guild meeting, on YouTube, or in a quilt show, remember, every quilt hanging there was once just a pile of fabric and a dream, just like yours. Because you know what? At the end of the day, quilting isn't about perfection. It's about connection and creativity and the joy of making something with your own two hands. Now, here's my bonus. Don't be afraid to ask for help and enjoy the journey. We all start somewhere, whether it's a quilt shop, a guild, or an online group. Ask questions. Quilters love to help quilters, and I love to help you. If you have a question, email Mary at Joyful and Mary Quilting, and I will really try my best to help you in any way I can. I love quilting. I love quilters, and it is my mission to help you achieve a joyful and merry quilting experience. Just ask. So there you have it. Quilting don'ts every quilter should know. If one of these made you laugh, or maybe they made you nod your head, hit that like button and share this video with a quilting friend. If you're interested in the pattern behind me, it's called A Beautiful Halloween Quilt, and it's available in our joyfulandmaryquilting.com store. The link is also in the description. And you know what? If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe for more Joyful and Mary quilting tips every single week. Until next time, I'm always trying to be joyful, but I will always be merry. Thanks so much for joining me.